Hello and welcome back. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the Amazon Simple Storage Service. Now that's a lot of S words, 3 of them to be exact. So we actually call the service S3. Now, data is the fuel that powers today's modern businesses. And there's endless types of data organizations need to store. Everything from documents, videos, spreadsheets, logs, user data, application data. And all this data can be tremendously useful to store and later analyze and help you understand your business and your customers, make better product decisions, and how to best serve your customers. Organizations today need a highly reliable and essentially unlimited way to store all these growing mountains of data. And this is where the S3 service can come and help us out. Now, S3 takes a bit of a different storage approach to what you may be thinking of comparing it to your typical laptop or computer hard drive. These are typically block storage devices that live inside your personal computers. So that PDF file you save is basically chopped up into chunks of data, and these chunks are stored within the data blocks that your hard drive is configured into. The operating system does the magic here of managing what blocks get written to and how to get the best use out of your drive capacity, and also keep track of what blocks actually make up the file once it's stored to disk. Now, if you make an edit to a file, generally you're just updating the blocks that would have the changed data in them. Now, S3 differs in that it's an object-based storage system. So rather than the data being written to some storage media as a bunch of blocks, the entire file is one single thing, an object. S3 gives us tremendous flexibility in the types of data we want to store. It doesn't really care what that file type really is. It treats the file as an independent object. And we can provide a bunch of our own information about that object to describe the file further, or other important information we may want to associate it with it called metadata. We can pretty much store any type of data as objects in S3. Anything from a 0-byte file where maybe we only have some type of metadata reference to it, but no actual object data, all the way up to 5 terabytes for a single object. Now, as AWS customers, if we store data in S3, we want to be sure it stays there. What good is the service going to be if the data becomes corrupted somehow and lost forever? Well, S3 is a very durable storage solution. AWS provides an 11 nines durability service level metric for this S3 service. Now, to put this in perspective, let's take a look at an old AWS blog post where they break this down a bit. This gives us a bit of a more real-world example of what this 11 nines of durability actually means for us. So from this blog post, it goes on to say that if we store 10,000 objects into the S3 standard tier of the service, over the span of 10 million years, only one of these 10,000 objects may be lost. And this level of durability is crazy to me. If you think about traditional data centers, even with very large IT budgets and top-of-the-line storage systems, it's extremely hard to come even close to this level of data durability that S3 offers us. Now, we mentioned with block storage that if you edit a file, you're likely just rewriting the data of those particular blocks that had the changed information. With objects, however, you can't edit them. You'd have to upload a new version of the updated object to replace the original one. Now, for some use cases, you may always want to have a copy of the changes of an object. So S3 also offers object versioning capabilities. So now if you update an object, the original is still saved along with the other updated versions if you have multiple changes to that object. So your object in S3 is always the latest changed version you uploaded last. But if some reason you needed to reference or restore a previous version instead, you always have that full version history at your fingertips. This versioning is also very helpful to protect against human errors. If the object is deleted by someone and you have versioning enabled, that object is basically just hidden instead of actually deleted. You're using what's called a delete marker, and it essentially just makes the object behave as if it's deleted, but it can be later restored if needed or recovered if it was accidentally deleted. Now, with S3, we store all our objects into something called a bucket. It's basically a just big logical container that we throw all our objects into. And you can create lots of these buckets to help organize your objects however you need. The buckets also become important when we get down to access controls. S3 provides us with a number of ways to prevent access to our buckets and the objects within them. S3 also gives us the flexibility to reduce our storage costs depending on our business needs and use cases of our objects we're storing there. So that 11.9's durability stuff is essentially the default S3 tier called S3 standard. But maybe we don't need that much durability. Or maybe these objects will rarely ever get used. We could be just trying to archive some data for compliance purposes. We might need to keep this information for a long time, like 10 years, but have no real need to use it on a regular basis. Like maybe we would access it once every 2 to 3 years for an audit or some type of investigation where we'll need to dig through those objects. But on a regular day-to-day perspective, this data is not being used. So what if we could trade off some of this durability or quick access to the objects for even further cost savings? And this is where different tiers of this S3 service come into play. So other than S3 standard, there's a number of options to fit our use cases. Now, let's take a quick look at the Amazon docs here to see what all these S3 tier service options look like for us. They have a great layout and it highlights some of the example use cases for each one. All right, so we're going to look at the Amazon S3 storage classes here. And first up, of course, we have S3 standard. Now, this is going to be for objects that we access a couple times a month, and we need to access them quite quickly. Here again, we have those 11.9s of durability, and it's also designed for 4.9s of availability. Now, quickly, what's the difference between these two? So durability in this context is more the measurement of the possibility of losing your data. Now, again, going back to our example, if you had 10,000 different objects stored in S3, based on this 11.9s of durability, it would take about 10 million years for the possibility of losing one of those objects. So again, most of the storage classes within the S3 service are very highly durable. So quickly again, durability is a measurement of the potential of losing data. Now this availability column speaks more to your ability to access the objects in S3. So as you can see, the access is a lot lower than the 11.9s of durability. Now basically what this means is that throughout a year, you may have a few minutes due to upgrades or different network issues that AWS may experience that you may not have access to your objects temporarily, but the objects themselves are still very safely stored because of that durability level. Now quickly, we have the availability zone column just showing the number of availability zones that your objects are replicated across. So with S3 standard, your objects are replicated at a minimum of 3 availability zones. Now the minimum storage duration we won't get into too much here, but some of the storage tiers have a minimum duration the objects have to stay within that tier before you can move it to a different one. Now the minimum billable object size here, some of the tiers will charge you for 128 kilobytes of storage, even if the object you add is a lot smaller than that. So if you had a small 10 kilobyte object here, you would still be charged for the 128 kilobyte storage cost for that object. Now this might not seem like a big deal, but if you do have, tens of thousands of very small objects, maybe just a few kilobytes in size, with these infrequently accessed storage tiers here, it's definitely something to do some calculations about to figure out if using these storage tiers would make sense. For certain use cases, the S3 standard may be actually the less expensive option. You'd pay a little bit more for the storage for S3 standard versus the infrequently accessed tiers, but because you have a lot of small objects, you're at a minimum paying for that 128 kilobyte size. So depending on the difference between the actual object size and this minimum here, multiplied across perhaps thousands of objects, there can actually be a lot of waste there. So you actually end up paying more for using these lower tier services versus the standard one. All right, so now that we have a better idea of some of the columns and what they represent here, we'll jump down to the next storage class, the S3 standard infrequently accessed, or IA. So here this is very similar to S3 standard. We still get the 11.9s of durability, but this is meant for objects that we may access just once a month, in contrast to S3 standard where we're accessing the objects more than once a month. Now this tier may be good for something like backups. We want those to be, again, highly durable, but our chances of using them may actually be quite low. So we can save a bit of money by using this infrequently accessed tier. Now for this example though, pay attention to the availability here. S3 standard infrequently accessed tier gives us slightly lower availability at 3 nines. So throughout the course of a year, our risk of not being able to access our objects might be a bit higher with the infrequently accessed tier. Now we may be saving a bit of money for our backups by using this tier, but because of the lower availability, they may not be accessible in those critical times when we need to restore something. Now 3 nines availability is still very good. Some type of service interruption that would cause your objects to be inaccessible at the exact same time you need to actually restore something or quite low, but it is certainly a risk to consider. Now another important thing is the per gigabyte retrieval fee for accessing your objects in this tier. So again, this tier is designed for objects that you only need to access about once a month. If for some reason there are some objects that you need to access, let's say 10 times a month, and the objects are maybe 20 gigabytes in size, this retrieval fee here can cost you more than if you would have just placed those objects in S3 standard. Now we'll jump down to the S3 intelligent tiering. Now this storage class is actually pretty interesting. And this is great if maybe we have a bucket that a lot of different teams use within our organization. Maybe we're part of a cloud infrastructure team and create a bucket for different groups to use. But we may not necessarily know the use cases or what types of objects or types of data that would be stored within it. And we don't know how frequently the objects may be accessed by all these different teams and people. So it'd be very hard for us to pick the best storage class to use. Now with S3 intelligent tiering, it essentially monitors your objects. And then based on the patterns it detects of how frequently those objects are being used, it'll actually transition some of your objects between the different storage class tiers. Now, because of all this monitoring and automation that AWS is providing us behind the scenes for this intelligent tiering storage class, there's a small fee per object. Now, because this charge is for each object, again, if you had tens or hundreds of thousands of very small objects within your bucket, the intelligent tiering storage class may not make sense. In some situations, again, the S3 standard storage class may actually be a lower cost option if you have a lot of smaller objects. Okay, I'm just going to clear off some of my scribbles here, and we'll continue to look at some of the other storage classes. So next up, we have the S3 one zone infrequently accessed. Now this is almost exactly the same as the other infrequently accessed tier, except that we have only one availability zone durability. Now this is almost exactly like the other infrequently accessed storage tier, except our data is only now in one availability zone. And that's an important thing to consider here, that this storage tier is not resilient to the loss of an availability zone. Along with that, we're also sacrificing a bit of the availability as well. Now this storage tier is great for something where you have data that you can regenerate. So maybe you have image files stored in S3 standard, but then from that original image, you might make thumbnails or convert it into different image file types. The thumbnails and other processed images can be stored in this one zone and frequently accessed storage tier to save costs. And then if something were to go wrong with the availability zone where your objects were stored in, you could recreate them. You'd still have the original image in the S3 bucket. You could trigger something to regenerate the thumbnails and other images that were processed after. So again, the S3 one zone and frequently accessed storage tier is designed for the recreatable and frequently accessed data. Now we start diving into the Glacier storage classes. So these S3 Glacier tiers are great for archive data. They're objects that you need to keep for a very long time and don't typically need to access them very frequently. The S3 Glacier tiers are extremely cost-effective for long-term storage. And there's a lot of options here based on how fast we need to retrieve this archive data. So for the S3 Glacier instant retrieval here, it's maybe data we need to access, sort of once a quarter with the typical millisecond access times. Then we have the S3 Glacier flexible retrieval, again for objects that we may access once a year, and retrieval times of minutes to hours. I'm just going to clean this up here, and then we'll look at the remaining storage classes. Now, sort of the last storage class here for S3 is the S3 Glacier Deep Archive. Now, this is a very low-cost storage option for very long-lived archived data. That's important to note here. This again is for data that you access less than once a year, but you have retrieval times of up to hours. So if you need quick access to your objects, the deep archive is certainly not a tier that you'd want to pick for that use case. Now last and kind of least is the reduced redundancy storage. This is sort of a legacy storage tier that's not recommended to use anymore. The better alternative now being the S3 one zone and frequently accessed storage tier. So that about covers it for our Amazon S3 storage class run through. I hope this was helpful to just showcase all the different storage classes within the S3 service. Now we quickly saw that intelligent tiering option for those unknown and unpredictable storage and access needs. But what if we know what our data is and what our use cases are and how that data would be used over time? Well, instead of having that slight cost overhead of using that intelligent tiering option to make that automated best guesses for us, we can use something called Lifecycle Policies here. So as an example, maybe we have database backups. Maybe we store these in S3 standard initially, as within that first month of the backup being created, it's the most likely when we'd need to actually restore from that backup. And when we need to restore a database, it's usually some critical issue that we need to fix fast. So we want instant access to the backup file object. We can't wait hours to retrieve it if our production environment is down and customers are complaining. Then maybe after 30 days pass, the chances of using that backup are a lot lower. We'd have more recent backups at that point that we'd likely restore from, rather than this one that's now 30 days old. But maybe we still want to keep it just in case, and we may also have some type of compliance reasons that we need to keep this backup data for perhaps like a number of years. But all these backups increase our storage costs. So after 30 days, we can have a lifecycle policy move that backup object to a different, less expensive S3 tier automatically. So our lifecycle policy configuration may look something like this. We'd have our backups in S3 standard for up to 30 days for that initial durable and instant access option here in case we need to quickly restore a database from it. Then after 30 days, it transitions that object into S3 infrequently accessed storage tier. We don't think we need to use the backups past 30 days, but just in case, it's there for us when we need it, and we're able to reduce our storage costs as well. Then after 90 days, the chances of needing that backup at that point are basically zero. But we still need to keep this data around for our regulatory compliance reasons. Here, our lifecycle policy may move the objects older than 90 days into something like Glacier Deep Archive. When you have these very long-term storage requirements for stuff you won't need to access much, the S3 Glacier tier should come to mind here. Basically, if you need to freeze your data on ice for many months or years, storing this type of data in S3 Glacier can significantly reduce your storage costs compared to S3 Standard and other storage options. Now, on this audit topic a bit, if you have other data that you need to store for compliance reasons, you can also use Glacier vaults and vault locks to further protect this data. You can put your objects in the Glacier vault with a vault lock and effectively prevent against changes to the data to help with your compliance requirements. Now, that should do it for our overview here of the Amazon S3 service. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson.